for organizing this seminar, and thank you, Rory, for your invitation. I'm very happy to share a moment with you talking about Vanuatu. So I'm an anthropologist. I'm conducting research in Vanuatu since 2011. And I'm working in the field of disasters and forced displacement. I've done most of my research in Vanuatu on Tonga Island, which is a central island of the archipelago. And I'm now working on the Ambai eruption that occurred in 2017 to 2018. And I'm also working with Philipson, which is with us today. So I will present you some ethnographic data. So it will not be a theoretical presentation, but very ethnographical one about Cyclone PAM and the way the international aid came to rebuild the island of Tonga, and the way their guidelines has modified maybe the resilience of the population. So maybe I can try to share my PPT with you. Can you see the PPT? The presentation? Yeah. So on March 13 and 14, 2015, Cyclone PAM swept through the archipelago of Vanuatu with wind speeds exceeding those recorded anywhere in the South Pacific since the 80s. The southern and central part of the country were particularly affected, and Tonga Island was one of them. Finding itself in the eye of the storm for about an hour. That night, torrential rain, raging sea, landslides, and the strength of a relentless wind profoundly altered the landscape and fully disrupted life and livelihood. The coastline was covered by a thick layer of sediment and debris that limited the access to the shellfish that were otherwise a major protein staple. Trees were defoliated, all subsistence gardens were severely devastated, and most houses had collapsed or were simply blown away. But despite these extensive damages, no one was reported dead, as during the storm, villagers found shelter in their kitchens, locally considered as a lifeboat. A few hours after the event had come and left, emergency organizations arrived on site to set up aid operations destined to help the disaster-stricken population. So in this presentation, I analyze how humanitarian aid was received on Tonga, as seen from the perspective of its beneficiaries. Inhabitants were not passive, but on the contrary, contested and resisted various components of the aid assistance program, which attempt to change the architectural context of the island. So my account builds on data collected before Cyclone PAM, between 2011 and 2014, then just after the Cyclone PAM in 2015, and again 3 years later in 2018. So as Rory said, the archipelago of Vanuatu is known for being particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change and is commonly exposed to large environmental hazards such as cyclones, landslides, volcanic eruption, earthquakes, etc. However, the local population has learned to live with disasters. They have developed specific knowledge and coping strategies reflected, among others, in the architecture of their so-called traditional houses, as illustrated by the ethnographic case I'm going to detail. To do so, let's consider first the architectural context of Tongwa prior to Cyclone Pam. So Tongwa is the biggest island of the central group of Shepherd Islands. It is home to 2,300 people living in 14 villages. Because of recurring destructive events, local house construction plays a major role in reducing exposure to disasters and their answering risk. The structures are adapted to tropical climatic conditions. Families build houses called Ekopu Mitongwa, literally House of Tongwa in Nakanamanga, the vernacular language. These are constructed of local material collected in the forest, including timber and fibrous rocks, as well as elements derived from cultivated plants at the edge of the subsistence gardens, such as sago palm, wild cane, and bamboo. So Ekopuni-Tongwa are largely built following methods passed down from generation to generation. Their features are cylindrical, semi-spheric, from and gable roof coming down to the floor. The thatch roof of the house is made from dried sago palm leaves from wild cane stalks, woven together and arranged in straggled rows with coconut palms. The thickness of those leafy tills, as well as that of the walls, ensure efficient weather resistance and allows the structure to remain fresh enough in hot weather and to filter out excessive humidity during rainy season. In order to limit their exposure to winds, they tend to be mostly built from west to east, and their openings, door and sometimes windows, are made on the eastern side of the structure. During bad weather, these houses are used as shelter and are considered by the families to be lifeboats. In fact, as the frame is low, adults can easily hold it in place by hanging onto it. That is why, to this day, when cyclone occurs, all families will seek refuge in the most recent of their traditional houses, namely those reckoned to be the most resistant, providing the best shelter against long hours of gust, of wind and torrential rains. But despite their exposure to many disruptive phenomena, inhabitants of Tongwa had not experienced a major cyclone since Uma in the 1987. So this temporary easing of the usual rate of climatic upheaval allowed for the adoption of new building techniques. Villagers explained that since the 80s, the shape of their houses had gradually evolved, increasingly adopting a rectangular shape of their houses and featuring additional openings. Whereas wild canes had previously been used to make the leafy tiling of the roof, they were since often replaced with sago palm, or this allow for quicker and work, require fewer people in the making of the tiles, and take up a much reduced surface of cultivated land compared to wild cane. Further, houses increasingly had walls and roofs reinforced with wooden planks or concrete blocks. They also used corrugated iron sheet, plastic tarps, fishnet, or even mosquito nets, both at the capital Port Vila. This dynamic innovation made more vulnerable to high wind during cyclones. So as a result, when Cyclone Pam bore down, more than 80% of the island's buildings were damaged by winds and floods. They later explained that during the storm, They held onto the frame of their houses to keep them in place. They patched holes blown open by the wind, blocked up windows with foam mattresses, and secured corrugated iron sheet or sago tiles when the structure threatened to blow away. When their shelter fell down or showed signs of weakness, they left them to seek refuge with a family whose house, located nearby, seemed more resistant. So, in the wake of Cyclone Pam, the extraordinary damages caused by the event, as well as its historic force, spurred intense media coverage around the world, which in turn facilitated the implementation of the humanitarian machine. Under the coordination and the direction of the Vanuatu government, several NGOs, UN international institutions, as well as military forces from Western countries, were sent into the most affected islands following the disaster. They then set up an array of urgent relief measure rehabilitation projects. The day after the cyclone, the Vanuatu government asked the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent to coordinate the humanitarian plan of action. This plan was implemented following the cluster approach, and a shelter cluster program was developed and placed under the supervision of the Department of Public Works in order to, I quote, provide emergency shelter and non-food items for people whose houses have been partially damaged or destroyed. So in this context, that distribution of rebuilding material was organizing on Tongwa. However, the villager did not wait the external aid to get to them, since they did not fathom in ever would to get started on rebuilding their village. And from the moment the gusts lowered in intensity, people told how they carry out the groundworks and clearing, as well as the first reconstructions. In Kurumambe village, the men tackled the task of rebuilding the latrines. The wind had entirely demolished all outhouses around. They also built spontaneous transitional houses from a new scattered remnant of building they could find on the ground. These rudimentary dwellings, asli cobbled together, were called in Bislama ghetto. This newly adopted word was used across Tongwa to express the precarity of those infrastructures and underscore their bleak appearance. Within a few days, all families in the village had a roof over their heads. In July 2015, 4 months after Pam, when I went back to the island, communities in Tongwa resembled camps for displaced persons. On the roof of every ghetto, one could spot various logos. The variety of identification, tags, and logos, as well as the sheer numbers of 4x4s on the island, signaled the multiplicity of humanitarian actors involved to handle this crisis. At that time, daily food intake was still based on the supply sent by the government. The last parcels were received in late June and on punctual aid from passing NGOs or native Tongwan politicians. At least once a week, a distribution of foodstuff took place. So my ethnographic investigation showed that the distributions carried out by this organization in the week following the catastrophe generated much confusion, bordering at times of defiance, because they failed to be framed within clear explanatory plans. The project undertaken by the NGO mandated by the shelter cluster drew my attention in the village of Kurumambe where I was staying. Let me clear that I'm not able to portray all the action carried out by the NGO, nor to do unqualified criticism of humanitarian intervention. My aim is rather to focus on the reaction of the beneficiaries and on the tension that this aid has generated into the community. So during the first week of July, about 10 employees, mostly expats, arrived on Tongwa to initiate the rebuilding of the schools and houses. Following a modus operandi established before by the Shelter Cluster program, the NGO classed the destroyed houses into two categories before organizing the distribution of material. So the first group was made up of the houses that had been entirely destroyed by the cyclone, while the second comprised those that had been partially damaged by the wind. According to their categorization, families received 10 to 20 sheets of corrugated iron, 1 to 2 bags of cement, wooden rafter, and nails. In total, 568 rebuilding kits were distributed across the island. All families interviewed explained that upon receiving those gifts, they were asked to sign a receipt by which they committed themselves to rebuilding their future house within the time frame dictated by the NGO. Meanwhile, it has organized awareness sessions according to the terms of Build Back Better. Inhabitants were thus invited to rebuild their dwellings according to these principles and with all material exogenous to the island, in the perspective of reducing their vulnerability to future disasters. So in this prospect, the NGO asked that the houses adopt a rectangular shape with a single slope roof, no higher than 3 meters. Apart from these guidelines, somewhat distant from the architectural norms favored up to that point by the locals and prevalent on the island, NGOs imposed a timeline. The villagers were asked to rebuild their new houses within 8 weeks. This time frame did not match with the inhabitants' calendar, for whom at this exact period, other tasks took priority, such as rehabilitating their subsistence gardens, reconstructing their water pools, attending to funerals of those who passed away during the weeks following the cyclone, etc. So in order to ensure the diligent and timely progressions of the works and with the objective of obtaining quicker results, the NGO asked all villages to nominate 2 people who would be tasked with organizing the building work in their community and with supervising its advancement. Despite these measures, the rebuilding effort did not follow the pace set forth and opted for by the NGO for at least 3 reasons. While the inhabitants showed enthusiasm at the prospect of receiving support from humanitarian assistance, it also generated contestations. In July 2015, shortly after arriving on the island, the NGO visited all villages to establish from systematic observation the exact individual and collective needs, and to evaluate the extent of the damage. In Korombe, the community expressed its desire to rebuild houses using local materials, sourcing them in the region that were spared by PAM. However, this request was not granted by the NGO, presumably insofar as local material did not correspond to a pre-established protocol of intervention. Rather than granting the wish of the villager, and as I mentioned, the NGO distributed corrugated iron, cement, and nails. The decision was interpreted by some of contempt toward them. On top of not being their first choice, corrugate iron had proven to be deadly during Cyclone on Thailand Island, so, which is a southern island of the archipelago. And the latent risks linked to its use had been keenly felt and were still perceived with concern. A second reason, accounting for the slow pace of the reconstruction, was the timeline imposed by the NGO, which was contested by the population. Some people explained that they did not wish to rebuild their house in a hurry, but rather wanted to keep the materials and save some money with the plan of buying additional materials to build a larger house. In effect, the elements received only enabled them to build a 200 square feet home, a surface deemed insufficient by those who planned on welcoming other members of the family. So others considered the priority not to be the reconstruction of their houses, as the temporary ghettos were enough for the moment, but the rehabilitation of the subsistence gardens in order to ensure quickly that they could provide enough food for their families on a daily basis. This reasoning guided the villagers' schedule, which, far from coinciding with that on the NGO, contradicted it and slowed down the progress of the rebuilding work. Finally, a third motive explaining by the pace of the works had to be slowed down was the unusual frequency of deaths following the cyclone. In August, the island went in mourning on 4 occasions. Here, like elsewhere in Vanuatu, when an individual dies, even when they were a distant relative, it is customary to visit the afflicted family to show compassion. After each death, a mourning period is locally declared by the representative of the aggrieved clan, thus bringing social life to a halt for at least 3 days. Usually, all activities that are unrelated to the death must stop, and all forms of noises must dissipate, as music, laughter, hammer blows, sounds of chainsaw, etc. So in this respect, all reconstruction works was proscribed and the materials distributed were reappropriated to serve purposes other than those initially defined by the NGO. These events delayed reconstruction work and went against aid priority. To remedy this situation, emissaries were regularly sent to the village to remind the villager of their commitment and their obligation to abide by the rules and comply with the demands of the NGO. During the mourn of an old lady of Kurumambe village, a new Vanuatu employee of the NGO from a northern island, and that had been recruited within the scope of this specific mission, showed annoyance at the situation and came to complain many times over about the delay caused by the villagers. He declared they were wasting their time respecting the custom rather than thinking about their homes. These comments were quick to travel around the village and amplified as different interlocutors repeat them. Within a few days, rumor had that if the reconstruction works were not completed by the time the NGO left the island, the organization, aided by the police, would come back and forcibly retrieve the material previously distributed. This revealed, once again, the tension and gaps in perception of priorities between the local population and the NGO. At the end of August, in Kurumambe, 4 houses were finished, while 4 others were only partially rebuilt. In December 2015, the work was still ongoing, and the NGO had left the place without getting its donation back. In July 2018, 3 years after the catastrophe, I carried out new ethnographic investigation to observe and better understand how the island had recovered from the catastrophe. At that time, Tongva only numbered 11 eco-pools in Tongva. This radically contrasts with the situation observed until the ebb of Cyclone Pan, as according to my observation, between 2013 and 2014, more than 70% of the households numbered on the island lived in Ecopool in Tonga. In 2018, the majority of houses seen on the island were mostly made with imported materials, mainly corrugated iron and concrete. In the opinion of the inhabitants of Tonga, the decline of vernacular construction models, predominantly using vegetal materials, was justified by the fact that timber and wild canes had been less available on the island since the cyclone. Another justification was the lack of motivation following the gift from the NGO, as those were not enticing them to rebuild their houses with locally sourced materials. Moreover, corrugated iron had long signaled modernity and development. Before PAM, sheet material was a building material that only a few privileged families could afford. Following PAM, the possibility of being given for free this onerous and highly coveted material did not encourage families to rebuild their lifeboats, following previous methods and using locally sourced components. Against this general trend, however, 11 families that had rebuilt their ecopool in Tonga following the traditional architectural model. This entailed collecting all these elements directly on the islands. Some of the people who decided to build these houses did not own one prior to the cyclone. However, since the disaster and under the influence of their village chief, they decided to revert back to the building techniques and of the old days, as they explained that the cyclone had paradoxically brought about new ideas which underscored the limitation of modern materials. Moreover, they declared their skepticism towards the efficiency and relevance of the gifts received from the NGO. The sheets of corrugated iron being particularly questioned. Some of these families had thus rebuilt a first house with the material distributed through the shelter cluster, and then had made another one where they could seek refuge in case of bad weather. Some chose to carefully consider where the best location was and what shape and orientation they should give this building to limit as much as possible its exposure to the wind. Though this renewed interest for customary practices is likely to spread in the coming years, and it is a safe assumption to think that each family will eventually own a lifeboat near the house they inhabit every day. This scenario is all the more likely given that in recent years, on Tonga Island and elsewhere in the archipelago, a pro-custom discourse has been emerging, outlining the value of traditional architectural practices. This includes considering as good anything pertaining to custom, such building a house with local material as following previously established norms. So to conclude, as Moati and all have underscored, if rebuilding does not start from scratch, a clean slate from which anything could be possible, it is not a natural process either, as it is conditioned by pre-existing structures which survives most of the time. The Tonguan example showed this. While the study was limited in time and space, it clearly reveals how humanitarian aid, when not focusing enough attention on the socio-cultural reality within which its project will unfold, is at risk of generating confusion among the recipients. The ethnography of this rebuilding project following Cyclone Pan allows us to access how efficient humanitarian response really is when it is a technical and standardized that is applied in a top-down manner instead of adopting a bottom-up approach. However, despite the gaps in perception and the diversity of local responses about the emergency of the situation and the priorities of action, most of my interlocutors welcomed humanitarian aid and approved the presence of outside aid workers in Vanuatu. This rebuilding project begs the question of the nature and durability of the distributed materials, as well as that of their relevance in an environmental context where cyclones are known to happen regularly, probably more so in the near future. Corrugated iron, while appearing as functional and answering quick reconstruction, does not seem particularly adapted to the region. In fact, on the night of Cyclone Pam, it did not fare any better and offer less resistance to the winds than the local materials used to make the Ikokumitongwa. If traditional structures are to be completely replaced by houses made of corrugated iron and concrete blocks, the very adaptive techniques that enable their specific construction, which have been passed down through generations through the regular process of rebuilding, may eventually disappear. Thank you, and sorry for my English reading.
Thank you very much, Maëlle. It was really interesting and nice to have an anthropologist's point of view of all of this. So we have a first question from Ben. So if you want to turn on your microphone, Ben.
Sure, I'm always asking questions, but
We can't hear you.
I'd like to just briefly say that
Ben, we can't hear you. I don't know.
Oh, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. You obviously can't trust me in a disaster because I pressed the wrong button. Anyway, that struck a chord with me when I was working as an employee of the Nicaraguan state. Several times we had disasters, or we didn't have disasters, but we had a natural event, and we found that NGOs. I once got a request from the UN to review a request for aid for a disaster that hadn't even happened. And we had a sense that NGOs were vying against each other to get funding. And it was almost more important for them to get the funding than to actually intervene in these places. And of course that's a very cynical point of view, but it was a gut feeling from being on the ground. I wonder how was the NGOs here, how were they invited in? Were there multiple NGOs? What was the relationship between them?
So some NGOs, they were already in Vanuatu. And then because of the cluster approach, they have to apply to win the leadership of the cluster. So it was Save the Children that earned the shelter cluster. And then all the NGOs were working under the supervision of Save the Children. And yes, as you say, they have some pressure to rebuild quickly the villages and cities of where they are working in, and sometimes it doesn't fit with the local reality.
Yeah, I think in a manner you answered my questions, mate. It was like, do you think the NGO's campaign was a success, and does it continue?
I don't know.
This is a strange question, I know. Okay, never mind. It's okay. Rory, you have a questions also?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Maëlle. That was really great, and it was fascinating, but also equally maddening. It makes me really angry to hear about particularly about the bit where you mentioned that they were told they shouldn't respect funerals and should get back to work constructing. So, yeah, that's really obviously frustrating. But I just wondered, did you, for the few families that did rebuild in traditional materials, did they have anything in common? Were they maybe, perhaps the older chiefs or something like that, and do you think maybe the others seeing that example might change their mind? And finally, a tiny last part: is there any update? What was the impact of Cyclone Harold in Tonga?
Okay, thank you, Rory. So I'll first answer to your last question. Hopefully for Tonga, Cyclone Harold didn't do any damage on Tonga Island because it was more for the North Islands, the one that have been saved during Cyclone Irma. So yes, about the new Ekoku Tonga, I'm sure in the next years, or maybe if I go back quickly on the field, I will notice that people now have rebuilt new houses to be sheltered in case of a new storm. But I don't know yet because what is also a reality now in Vanuatu is that people, they don't want to live in the traditional model or in custom houses, but they want development, concrete houses, corrugated iron, and it's also like a reality. And yeah, it's a reality. So maybe they will have both. I don't know. Like the 11 family, their opinion was to have both, but they were also in 4 different villages where their chiefs, their custom chiefs, were against the NGO when the NGO were acting in 2015 and encourage their people to rebuild their traditional houses. So I think it's also depend of the villages and yeah.
Perfect. Thanks.
Thank you. We have a question also from Philipson, if you want to turn on your microphone.
Thank you. I was wondering, given the size of the island, it is not a big island, right?
No.
And there, I think there's about 2,000, more than 2,000 people living on that island, right?
Yeah.
So I was wondering, my question is, after a category 4, you have that's a strong cyclone, then it probably destroy or cause damage on the island and even on the environment around. I mean, trees may fall.
Yeah.
So do you think people can easily find material to build back their houses after such damage? And trees takes times to grow, right? So I do understand you talked about the material changing and houses are changed, but I was wondering as well if these there was no material coming from donors, would they be able to build back their houses quickly if the cyclones strike and damage all the a huge amount of huge areas on the island? It's just a thought.
Yes, thank you, Philippe. So that's true. But the point is that before Cyclone Pan, people were less and less cultivated like wild cane, which is a well-resistant plant against gust. But there were more and more planting sago trees that are less resistant to cyclone. So yes, after Cyclone Palm, they were not able to rebuild quickly a new traditional house. But after 2 years, or even 3 years in 2018, the trees were like the sago palm trees. They were enough big to to touch, or the Vulcan were enough important to be used, but the priorities were not to rebuild traditional houses, despite of the material. It was more, I think, a volunteer.
So if we, for instance, allow the aid to come in, they will change all the system in place. Because once they build a stronger house, then it will be difficult to come back and try to build a traditional house.
But the thing is that I'm not sure it's a stronger house, because the corrugated iron is not like, people cannot hang to them during cyclone to make sure the roof stay during between every gust, and it's not very resistant to time because of humidity and the weather. So I don't know how the situation will be in 10 years maybe, and I don't know if people will be safe if another cyclone occur, like Cyclone 5, like a category 5.
So if you say it will take about a few years before traditional material will be available, what would you suggest to how do I say, to encourage people not to bring the how do I say, to keep the traditional houses? You know, this lapse of time is about 2 years, but that's a lot for the people to try and wait for the material to come up.
Yeah.
Do we have any suggestion?
But the question was to plant more wild cane, and as people do in AP Island, just the closest island of Tongua. So one of the points will be to plant more wild cane, or to plant more sago palm to be ready for the next disaster. But again, the difficulty, I think, is that people don't want to live in a traditional house. I mean, the main thought when I was there in 2018 was not to be back in the traditional way of life, but to move on to development. Mm. And also, as an anthropologist, I never feel very comfortable to tell people what they have to do.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. But that is not specifically for Tonga. I can see that on other islands. Yeah, it's changed very fast. I was wondering if there's any possibility we can keep those traditional houses, but I'm not sure we can.
I'm not sure anyway. We can. Yeah, but one point is to encourage the Vanuatu Cultural Center to do some campaign to promote the traditional houses and techniques to maintain them in the islands around Vanuatu. I mean, I think it's their work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Shireen, you have, I think, maybe it's not a question, but if you want to turn on your microphone.
Yeah, hi everyone. I just had a comment. It tends to be the morning. It's after 4 here in Jamaica. It tends to be the what you'd say now, an unfortunate sort of circumstance when developing countries, for example, have NGOs. It's good to have NGOs, but on the one hand, there tends to be a lack of a conversation necessarily to bring somebody into the light. It is always assumed that local population or local residents don't know what they're doing, or they need to know better, or we have the best knowledge. But people have been resilient for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and they've functioned, and their structures have worked. So if you bring them into the know, because maybe the hurricanes are getting stronger, they're getting more dangerous, your buildings are not as resilient against this kind of wind, then it has to be a conversation and not just a telling with consequences. And I think this is why we have so much opposition when you have local it feels all within the context of disaster risk reduction, with the local people. And Maëlle, you said as well, there needs to be have the people appreciate a change could be, rather than just something on them that they are not accustomed to, and that their own traditions just you know, they have rituals and they would like to perform those, you know. So I think that some NGOs, I won't say all of them, NGOs, they need to respect some of the local traditions and try to marry that with their own processes to be able to become successful. That's all I wanted to say.
Yes, thank you. And
Thank you, Shireen.
the thing is that in Vanuatu, people arrived only 3,000 years ago. So all the disasters they are facing right now were already there when they arrived, and they have developed specific knowledge and way to live with these disasters. And the thing is that now when NGOs come to run a farming sessions, they are mostly expat people that never expect or live with these disasters. So this is also like a comic situation. Hearing people coming from northern countries, telling people that have always lived with a cyclone, how to deal with them and how to be resilient.
That's a good point. Ben, you have a question also, I think. Another one.
Not really. I guess it was just a comment because there's a new film in Volcania just up, but thing that reminded me is you can see the Cuban hurricane shelters built in the farms, which are exactly like the traditional Vanuatu houses. So it seems that there's a network, or there are traditional ways of building which are globally used, which are adapted. Maybe a registry or a study of these global usages could help the different sites realize that what they're using is perhaps the best way of going about it. And I'd just like to say it's not just a problem in Vanuatu. In this city of Clermont-Ferrand, outside, we have a problem of using concrete where they could just use local stone for many walls and objects around here, and that would improve the environment of the city no end. But that has, the use of the local stone has more or less been lost, and it's a bit of a struggle now to get that reintroduced. So what's a problem in Vanuatu is a problem in Clermont-Ferrand as well.
Yeah. Okay, so we do not have other questions. So if you want to engage in a discussion, do not hesitate. And I don't know.
Does anybody else have any comments and questions?
Maëlle, did you hear many people mentioning climate change when you were there? Was that a big discussion on the island?
It's now becoming like a topic, but when I was there between 2011 and 15, climate change was everything. Like when people noticed a change in their environment, they were asking if it was climate change or not. Like mangoes, like early mangoes was climate change. more rain was climate change, less rain was climate change, because it's not very concrete, so everything could be climate change. And it's also an expression in this llama. I know that sometimes people, they like to say, hey, you climate change, when a people is a bit crazy or to joke each other, they say, "Oh, you climate change." Is because now everybody is talking about climate change, but we don't know what is climate change or what does it mean. But since few years now, people, they know that thanks to climate change, they can earn money to do projects. They in Vanuatu now have a climate change ministry. Like billions are coming to manage project about climate change in Vanuatu. So it's a subject, but still people don't know what is climate change. I think so. It's, yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so just before we finished, I put the link for the next webinar just here. And of course, I would like to thank Maëlle and Rory for your presentation. It really makes me want to go to Vanuatu and study here. It was really interesting from both point of view. I think it was a great session, yeah. So thank you very much to all for also your participation, all your questions. And I wish you again Happy New Year and be safe at home.